Hello again, everybody. Welcome to the Pre-ETS Representative Training Module number 5 on purchasing pre-employment transition services. This is the 5th in a series of 6 training modules, which were recorded in February of 2021. This training will be a review of the steps for purchasing pre-ETS through our contracted providers. Note that all new pre-ETS representatives will also need to take another more comprehensive purchasing training with one of the field operations specialists, and they will walk you through more detailed aspects of this process. So the agenda for this module will be a review of all of the following items: the pre-ETS referral process, pre-ETS authorizations, pre-ETS reporting and invoicing process, pre-ETS service types, titles, and definitions, and then other possible services listed on contracts. So let's start by looking at the pre-ETS referral process. The pre-ETS referral process is pretty straightforward. When you're making a referral to a PT contracted provider, you will use the pre-ETS referral for potentially eligible students, which is linked on this slide. And I'm going to open it real quick here. It's 3 pages long. Again, pretty straightforward, self-explanatory. There's a couple things I want to note on here. First of all, if you look on page 3, you only complete page 3 when you're referring a student for a work experience. So keep that in mind. Also, on this section here, reason for referral, you'll be checking off which of the pre-ETS services you're referring for, and then you'll see a section that says expected results from each of those services. It is important to indicate what you hope a student will accomplish as a result of the pre-ETS services that you're referring them for. And so with that, I want to go back real quick here. You'll see on this slide that I have another link to the pre-ETS framework. And if you recall in the pre-ETS framework, which I'll bring up again, within each of the 5 pre-ETS services, we list performance measures. So these performance measures can help you with completing that referral form. You don't have to list, exactly what's on here, or certainly you don't need to list everything that's on here, but it can at least help you with get an idea with what you're hoping that the providers will be offering and providing to the students when you're referring them for pre-ETS services. I'm going to go back here. Also, these items that are on this slide also will help you when you're referring students for pre-ETS services. And these items you should have available to you throughout the rest of this training module. So the first is the pre-ETS desk aid, which lists the service types and titles. We also have the pre-ETS definitions for PT contracts, and it's a document that shows what's encompassed in each of the pre-ETS services when you're referring. And then also there is a page on our SharePoint site called the pre-ETS services by partner. And that's where you can go to see all of our providers that have pre-ETS on their contracts and see which of those pre-ETS services they provide. So let's get into pre-ETS authorizations, which is after you have completed the referral, you'll be completing an authorization. So first of all, what is an authorization? Our state law requires that we approve any funds prior to a service being provided. And it's also called an encumbrance, a prior encumbrance for any expenditure of funds. So that approval and encumbrance comes in the form of an authorization from VRS for each individual that a community partner serves. We are not able to pay for any service that occurs prior to an authorization. When you create an authorization, you will work with the provider staff to decide together how many hours are reasonable for each student, and it's a team decision. You'll want to authorize enough hours to be sure that the time will be covered, but you won't want to authorize extreme amounts of time. So let's review all the different items that you can be authorizing time for. The first is pretty self-explanatory. It's the service. So the time providing the pre-ETS to students, whether it's individually or in groups. So the second is first meeting. Unfortunately, RSA does not allow us to authorize funds for an intake for a student who's potentially eligible for services. So as an alternative, I guess I should say, we authorize for a first meeting. So this is the time when you and the provider and the student and any others that are supporting that student will meet to talk about the services that will be provided. The next is preparation time, and that can include preparing and revising lesson plans, preparing content for any one-on-one sessions, getting materials for sessions ready, any communications or attempted communications with the student or others on that student's team, editing resumes and cover letters, and any other documents they work on related to work experiences. The next item is employer development time. So that's any time when the provider needs to reach out to employers for a particular service. Oftentimes that's for work experiences or any other work-based learning. It also could be if they're reaching out for an employer to be a speaker in a classroom. So anytime calling, emailing, visiting to arrange for any of those opportunities, as well as any time that the provider spends on internet job searches, etc. The next item is team meetings. So anytime that a provider spends at a meeting with the student, the VRS staff, and any other team members, such as an IEP meeting, can also be authorized. The reason that they're attending those meetings is to report on the progress of pre-ETS as well as to help coordinate pre-ETS with other services. Lastly is travel time. So that's round trip time for the provider going to and from where they're going to provide services. So, and it can also include time for the provider to pick up or drop off a student. One other thing to note with travel time, which is a benefit to our providers, is that they are able to bill travel time even when a student doesn't show up for their appointment. However, we do ask providers to let the VRS staff know when that occurs so that VRS staff can follow up with the student to help prevent no-shows happening in the future. So with preparation time, note that there is a limit on what we would want to authorize and what providers can bill for. They can bill up to 50% of the service time for prep time. So here's an example to help wrap your head around it. So let's say a provider is going to provide a job exploration counseling session that will last 1 hour. We're able to authorize up to 30 minutes for prep time for that session. Also keep in mind that all the items that we listed on slides 9 and 10, all the items that can be included within the service time that we authorize for are all rolled into the service titles. So there's not separate line items for preparation and travel. It's all rolled into whichever pre-ETS services the provider is going to be providing. They do need to identify that time in their reports, however. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So in terms of the hours that you will be on the authorization, that must be negotiated between you as the VRS staff person and the community partner staff. So you'll want to discuss all of those items listed on slides 9 and 10 and talk about how much time they're going to need and then include that in the time that you'll authorize. It's really important that our community partners monitor those authorizations. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. So best practice on authorizations is to indicate the amount of time for any of those extra items that are beyond the service time. And here's an example. Let's say you are authorizing for 8 hours of job exploration counseling, and it's going to include 2 hours of travel time and 1 hour of prep time. So the total amount that's going to be authorized is 8, but it will have 3 hours included in there for those things. So again, on the authorization, it will list 8 hours. The service will be job exploration counseling, but then in parentheses, that's where you would denote includes 2 hours travel, 1 hour of prep time. This slide reviews the schedule for pre-ETS authorizations. Box number 1 lists 4 possible end dates that you must choose from for each authorization. And you will see that they are quarterly options. So there's March 31st, June 30th, September 30th, or December 31st. Then, as is indicated in box number 2, there can be any start date, but you would always need to choose one of those 4 end dates. We ask that when in choosing the end date, you select either the nearest end date or the one after that. So as an example, let's say you are referring a student to a provider for services that will begin on December 1st. And the provider is likely going to be providing services till the end of the school year. Although December 31st is the nearest end date, you can choose March 31st, but you shouldn't choose June 30th as the end date. And then, as you'll see in box number 3, providers have 90 days from the authorization end date to invoice for the services. There is one exception to using the 4 quarterly end dates that were listed on the previous slide, which is when a student will no longer be able to continue receiving pre-ETS because they no longer meet the definition of a student with a disability. In other words, they will no longer be enrolled in an education program, or they will be turning age 22. Here are 2 examples. The first is a student who is graduating high school on May 30th. They are not enrolled in a post-secondary education program that leads to a credential, so that means pre-ETS services must end on their graduation day. The authorization would have May 30th as the end date. The second example is a student who turns age 22 during the summer outside of a regular academic year. In that case, pre-ETS must end on the day they turn 22. Keep in mind, however, that if they turn age 22 during a regular academic year, that they can receive pre-ETS through that academic year. So in that case, a pre-ETS authorization would need to end on the last day of school for that academic year. Although VRS is able to extend end dates on authorizations if there are hours remaining, we no longer allow that to happen with pre-ETS authorizations. Instead, when an end date is nearing, you'll want to ensure a new authorization is put in place if those hours are needed. Why? This is because it allows us to have a better handle on where our pre-ETS spending is at. The only exception to this is when a new authorization was not put in place in time. You can work with your support staff to extend the end date to cover any services that took place past the end date to avoid what's called an MS-16. We're not going to be covering what MS-16s are in this training, but it will be covered in other purchasing training that you will be receiving. The rates for Pre-ETS services are consistent statewide. For individual or one-on-one services, the rate is $75 an hour. For group services, when there are 2 or more students who participate, the rate is $30 an hour. However, when you authorize for group services, you should still always authorize it at the individual or one-on-one rate of $75 an hour. So no matter what, whether it's an individualized service or a group service, we'll always authorize at $75 an hour. Providers have been trained that this is the process, and that when they invoice, they should bill at the group rate of $30 an hour if 2 or more students participate. Providers are able to bill VRS the group rate of $30 an hour for time preparing for a group service. So here's an example. There were 4 students that participated in a 1-hour workplace readiness training. The provider is invoicing 30 minutes for the prep time. So each student invoice would be for 1.5 hours of workplace readiness training, which would be $30 times 1.5 hours equals $45. On the other hand, providers should bill $75 an hour maximum for their time for traveling to a group service. So for the example above, let's say that the provider drove 1-hour round trip, 30 minutes each way, 1 hour total, to provide the workplace readiness training. 1 hour of travel would be $75 an hour. Then they would need to divide the $75 by 4 students, which adds up to $18.75 a student. Monitoring authorizations is very important, and it is the responsibility of both VRS and provider staff to keep track of them. You should be prepared to review authorizations as each quarterly end date nears to see which are ending, and then reach out to providers about creating new authorizations as needed. Provider staff need to be communicating with you if they are getting close to using up all the hours on the authorization and need more time. Again, VRS cannot pay for any time that was not authorized. They too must watch those quarterly end dates and be sure that new authorizations are put in place as appropriate. So here is another example of an authorization for you. A community partner will be providing a 1-hour classroom service for 10 students once a week at Anoka High School for 6 weeks. 2 hours of this series will cover career exploration, 2 hours will cover post-secondary exploration, and 2 hours will cover communication skills, which is within the category of workplace readiness training. It is estimated that it will take 1 hour round trip for travel time for each session. Furthermore, the provider needs 30 minutes of preparation time for each session. So the authorization will be as follows for each student. 5 hours of pre-ETS job exploration counseling services, which includes 2 hours travel and 1 hour prep. 5 hours of pre-ETS post-secondary education counseling services, which includes 2 hours travel and 1 hour prep. And 5 hours pre-ETS workplace readiness training services, again, including 2 hours travel and 1 hour of prep. The total amount of the authorization would be 15 hours times $75 an hour, which equals $1,125. Now let's move into the pre-ETS reporting and invoicing process. Providers may have questions about the difference between reporting and invoicing for pre-ETS versus other VR services. And they've been told that it is essentially the same process, which also means that it is the same whether a student is eligible or potentially eligible for VR. And just as it is with any VRS service, the invoice and the accompanying report should be emailed together to the email address printed on the specific authorization. Furthermore, the dates on the invoice and the report should match, and these dates must also be within the dates on the authorization. Also, an invoice should only be for one authorization. And in the cases where a provider is invoicing off of multiple authorizations, then there should be multiple invoices that match those authorizations. The dates on the invoice can be a range of dates, but the report should list out each date that the services were provided, along with how much time was spent providing each service. And invoices and reports should also indicate if the service was provided to an individual or one-on-one, or to a group of students, which would be 2 or more students. Reports must include a description of the services that were provided with sufficient detail to give VRS staff a good picture of what took place. They should also include the service time, preparation, team meetings, employer development, and transportation time that were provided. And for transportation, they must also list the starting location, destination, and ending location. And here are a few more notes related to reports. If services are not complete, a partial report can be submitted for the services provided to date. For instance, providers are encouraged to bill VRS monthly, even when services go longer than a month. For work experience wages, the provider must submit the student's time card or a list of all the dates and times that the student worked. And keep in mind that documentation time, such as report writing, case notes, or creating invoices, is built into the service structure, the fee structure, and so it's not a billable item. None of those things are billable. And you and providers can see some sample reports by clicking on the link here and then going into the resources tab. The requirements for invoices are as follows. For dates of service, a range of dates is acceptable on the invoice. However, the report must show the actual dates the services were provided. They must all include a unique invoice number. They must reference the authorization number. They must list the type of service, number of units, and the cost per unit. And they also must list a remit to address. Furthermore, as we indicated earlier, invoices must be submitted within 90 days from the end date of the authorization. They cannot contain handwritten information. If a service includes time less than a full hour, it should be rounded to the nearest quarter hour. And again, in order for VRS staff to process the invoice, there must be an accompanying report. I imagine that all of these details can seem a bit overwhelming, but don't worry. I've been there myself. I know what it's like, and every other staff person in the agency has been there. And I can assure you that in time, it will all make sense. In the meantime, remember that you have the support of your coworkers to go to with questions. And we also have a number of other resources that can assist you, which I'm going to review right now. First, we have a Pre-ETS page on the DVRS website. That's our external website that's for our professional and technical contracted providers. And that page can also be useful to you. All of the remaining resources I'm going to review are on that page, or that I'm going to review here on the slide are on that page. And so once I'm done reviewing them, I'm going to go to the web page real quick to show you where you can find them. So the next item on here is the Pre-ETS Authorizing Reporting and Invoicing Guide. And it has all of the information that's been reviewed in this presentation. So it's just in a different format for you, all in a nice Word document. We also have a Pre-ETS invoice template, which has all the required items that must be included on invoices, and it serves as an example of what a pre-ETS invoice could look like. Also, there is a VRS invoice report and report checklist. It's a desk aid you could use to help ensure that all required items are in place with invoices and reports so that payment can be made. Know that this checklist does not need to be submitted with invoices. So I am going to take you to the web page real quick. And here it is. When you go onto the page, it says Pre-ETS resources for PT contracted providers. There are a number of different tabs here, and the tab that I am referencing is the resources tab. So there are quite a few things on here. And some of these things are items you already know about, like our videos and some of our flyers, the Pre-ETS toolkit. But then we have the Pre-ETS authorizing, reporting, and invoicing guide. And the first link on here will take you to that guide. There's a second link that shows some revisions we are making in March. And so that's just to help those that had the old guide to see some changes that were made. But I would recommend you just look at the first link, because the old version probably, it wasn't something you were probably using. And then we have the Pre-ETS invoice template next, and then the VRS invoice and report checklist. There's some other items on here, but we'll talk about those later. Just so you know too, we also have recorded trainings on here in the recorded trainings tab. It's a series of modules, just like the modules you're watching, except they're for our providers. There's also some training about some of the websites that we have access to for both providers and VRS staff. You'll see eTrack, Virtual Job Shadow, and MCIS. So we have links to all of that training. All right, go back to our slides. Now we're going to shift gears and review Pre-ETS service types, titles, and definitions. Okay, and going through this section of the training, I'll be reviewing what is on the Pre-ETS desk aid, as well as what is on the Pre-ETS definitions for PT contracts document. The area circled here on the Pre-ETS desk aid indicates where all of the Pre-ETS service types and titles are listed. And then go to the next slide. And this reminds you what the Pre-ETS definitions for PT contracts document is, and it's linked on here. So when VRS authorizes for services, a service type and title is indicated on the authorization. So this is taken from the PT contracts definitions document. And this is an example from Pre-ETS job exploration counseling. So the type is the broad category in the colored box on top. And then the title is job exploration counseling services, which is listed below. And here is how the type and title look on the Pre-ETS desk aid. So this is just the top portion on that right-hand side of the desk aid. And then this is taken from an authorization, and you can see where the service type and the service title are listed on an authorization. So note that when you go to the Pre-ETS contracts on SharePoint, which we again have linked here, when you get into the contract for a provider, you will scroll down to see the Pre-ETS required services, just like it looks on here. And that's where you'll find what each partner has on their contract. The thing to note here is that PT contracts do not list the service type. They only list service titles. So let's just review all of the pre-ETS services that would be on a contract. And the first will be job exploration counseling. The definition of this service type matches the definition on the time charging section of the desk aid. And there's just one service title, which is job exploration counseling services. So I have that type and title circled on the right-hand side there. And then here is where you can find the definition of job exploration counseling services on the definitions for PT contracts document. You'll see that it matches the definition on the desk aid, although it also notes that job exploration counseling can include setting up classroom speakers who discuss careers. Other examples of job exploration counseling services that a provider could offer would be something like administering an interest inventory, researching careers on websites, and they can also offer group activities and lessons related to exploring careers in a classroom setting. So those are just some examples. So next we'll review Pre-ETS work-based learning, where, and then, so I'm here on the Pre-ETS work-based learning portion of the desk aid. I've circled on the right-hand side where you'll find the type and the three titles, as well as the definition of what's all included within work-based learning in the time charging portion of the desk aid. And then the definition for the PT contract, we have circled here. So it's a pretty big section on that document. Work-based learning is the only Pre-ETS required service that has more than one title, and it actually has three titles. They are introductory work activities, work experience services, and work experience wages. So let's review the definitions of those three titles. First, we have introductory work activities. So there are 5 items listed within introductory work activities. The first is career mentorship experience, which is facilitating an opportunity for a student to engage with a mentor who teaches or provides career-related guidance and advice. The second is informational interview, which is when a student gains information and advice from someone working in a career or job that interests them. The third is job shadow, which is when a student is able to observe different jobs and ask questions about them. The fourth is service learning, and that's an activity for a student that integrates meaningful community service with classroom instruction. And last but not least is workplace tour or field trip, which is an excursion for a student to gain firsthand observation of specific work sites. So any one of those 5 items can be provided if you authorize for introductory work activities. So the second title is work experience services, which, as it says here, is to facilitate a work experience intended for the student to understand the nature of work and build soft skills. Only the student and the business will report on how the experience went. In other words, when we're asking how things are going, or if we want some ratings on how the student is doing, we would only ask the student or the employer for that. So there are 3 ways that a provider can support work experiences. The first would be to assist a student with obtaining an intermediate job where an employer pays the wages. The second is to develop a site where a student works on a short-term basis, and VRS authorizes work experience wages for the provider to pay the wages. And the third would be to place a student in a set site that has already been developed in order for a student to work on a short-term basis. And once again, VRS would authorize work experience wages. Here is another way to view the 3 types of work experience services. First, I want to explain what intermediate job means. For students that are in the full VR program, our job is to work with them until they are successfully employed and then we close their case file. We call that job their final job, or the ultimate career position that the person wanted to achieve. However, when we help students find a work experience, we delineate that from the final job by calling it an intermediate job. We wouldn't close the full VRS case file after the student obtains the work experience because it typically isn't their ultimate goal. So it's a stepping stone on the way to that ultimate position. Another way we can explain it is that a regular job in the community is where an employer pays the wages. When we refer a student for assistance to find that type of work experience, we can authorize up to 30 hours. That 30 hours includes the time it takes for the provider to help with the job search, to assist the student to orient to the experience, and then to follow up with them afterward. The other type of work experience that you can refer a student for is a short-term experience where VRS funds for a provider to pay the wages. In the case where the site needs to be developed, we can authorize up to 20 hours. This includes time for the provider to develop the site, to orient the student to the site, and then follow up with them. And in the case where the site is already developed, for instance, it could have been developed by an internal VRS staff person, by the school, or the provider could have a connection already. We can authorize up to 10 hours for the provider to orient the student to the work experience and then follow up with them. This slide reviews all the activities that can be included within the hours for providing work experience services. So the first thing is the first meeting, where you as the Pre-ETS representative would develop the work experience, or you would meet with the provider and the student, and the provider actually would complete a placement plan. We'll talk more about that in the next module. The second thing is time for the provider to help the student find or set up the work experience. The third, again, is orienting the student to the work experience, and that can include assisting them with knowing who their supervisors are, understanding their schedule, making sure they understand their work duties, helping to finalize transportation to and from the work experience, ensuring they have their uniform, as well as making sure they know the expectations of the work experience. Lastly, it also can include following up or checking in with the student and the employer for as long as is needed. That amount of time would be agreed upon by you, the student, and the provider, and the employer as well, and anyone else that might be involved on that student's team. The last title within work-based learning is work experience wages, which allows for a provider to pay the wages and personnel costs of a short-term work experience. The community partner is the employer of record, and thus the wages are paid by the community partner. Keep in mind that only the student, again, and the business report on how the experience went, and that this service is intended to be used in conjunction with work experience services. So this is just about paying the student's wage. The statewide rate for this service will be the employee's wage plus 50% for administrative costs. So again, when we think about the wages, the provider must assess what the prevailing wage is, or the wage that is typical for this position. So if a student's doing a work experience in a business where they have other individuals working as an entry-level employee there, it would typically be what that wage would be. If they're working in a place where they don't typically have an entry-level position similar, then the provider would want to look at other businesses in the region that have similar positions. Then again, we add 50% of that wage to the rate to cover the provider's administrative costs. We mentioned this earlier, but we want to say it again, that VRS staff can support unpaid work experiences But rather than authorizing for a provider to assist in setting those up, we would like you to work with internal placement staff on that instead. And you must remember to consult with and receive approval from your supervisor for arranging for an unpaid work experience, and that consultation must be documented in your case notes. There are some work-based learning activities that are not reflected in the service titles, so I'm going to review some of those and the reason for them not being in the service titles next. So when you look at the desk aid, you'll see again that there's that list of work-based learning options on the left-hand side there in the time charging section, which is much longer than the number of service titles we have on the right. So for example, work experience and internships are both reflected in the work experience services title. So that's one reason, but it's not the only reason. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more. So here's the list of all the possible work-based learning activities, again, that were in the last slide. And then I've highlighted here in bold those that are not reflected in service titles. So that includes career-related competitions, practicum, simulated workplace experiences, student-led enterprises, volunteering, and youth apprenticeship. And also, again, the unpaid internships and work experience are also highlighted. So the reason that these items are not reflected as a service title is because they are services that are supported or funded by schools or other entities. So again, in the case of unpaid work experiences, as we said earlier, it's because we want you to work with internal staff versus authorizing for it. So the next slides review the definitions of all those items because students still can participate in them, and it's still something we can support. We're just not going to authorize for them. So we've got career-related competitions, which are activities that require students to demonstrate mastery of career-related skills through events that are judged by professionals. A practicum is a course of study devoted to practical training in the field and are usually supported by post-secondary institutions. Simulated work experiences are just that. They are activities that simulate work environments. Junior Achievement is a great example, and they have something called JA Finance Park. I have a link to Junior Achievement here. That's where students can come and learn about personal finance and career exploration through lifelike businesses. Student-led enterprises are school-based opportunities like school stores and coffee shops. Volunteering, we all know what that is. It's donating your time for a cause or an organization. And finally, youth apprenticeship is a very specific program that offers paid work experience within a specific career pathway. This is only supported by schools and is monitored by the Minnesota Department of Education. Okay, let's move on to the next Pre-ETS service type and title, which is post-secondary education counseling. So once again, I've circled the service title, type and title on the right, and then the definition that you can find on the left-hand side within the time charging portion of the desk aid. And then here's where you can find post-secondary education counseling for PT contracts. It mirrors exactly what we have as our definition on the desk aid, which is here. There's just one title within post-secondary education counseling services, and some examples of what PT contractors might provide includes post-secondary research, tours, application assistance, or FAFSA assistance in a one-on-one or group setting. Next is workplace readiness training, again circled on the desk aid. And here's where it is on the definitions for PT contracts document. There is just one service title for workplace readiness training, and it can include any of the 4 items listed on the next 2 slides. The first is benefits information services, which assists a student to understand how their benefits work in order to help them with their career planning. This is a high-level overview and is very general in nature. Some students need more comprehensive benefits services, such as a benefits analysis that is not included as a pre-ETS service. That's considered a more comprehensive VR service. There's independent living services or training, which is about assisting a student to understand independent living skills, financial literacy skills, communication, interpersonal skills, and other soft skills necessary for employment. Public transportation is assisting a student to understand how to use public transportation. And then lastly is the full definition of job seeking skills training, which is all about teaching students all aspects of finding or keeping a job. So it includes preparing resumes, job applications, practicing interviews, learning about employer expectations, and things like that. Okay, let's move on to the next type, which is pre-ETS instruction and self-advocacy. And as usual, we circled it on the desk aid for you so you can see where the type and title is, as well as our typical definition that we have in the time charging section. And here's where you find it on the definitions for PT contracts document. And that definition is also listed on this slide. Again, there's just one title, which is Instruction and Self-Advocacy Services. And some examples of what a provider could offer could be a self-advocacy workshop, a mentoring or leadership program that you could choose to refer students to, and other items that are similar to that. And now I want to talk about pre-ETS auxiliary aids. And I have that one circled on the desk aid. And then you'll see that there are 6 service titles under that type. So you will not find these listed on the pre-ETS definitions for PT contracts document. And the reason for this is because we do not purchase these items from PT contracted providers. They are typically purchased off of state contracts instead. So what are auxiliary aids? Auxiliary aids are for individuals, or in the case of pre-ETS students, who have sensory disorders. So that would include those who are deaf, hard of hearing, or those with visual impairments, or those that have communication disorders, such as cerebral palsy that impacts a person's ability to use speech. So it's only for those types of disabilities. If you want to learn more about auxiliary aids, you can view Guidance Chapter 4F, Auxiliary Aids and Services for Effective Communication, which has more detail. So again, there are 6 titles included with pre-ETS auxiliary aids, and I'm going to review those 6 titles and definitions here. I'll just say it's the one service and support of pre-ETS that RSA allows students who are potentially eligible to receive. So the first on here is CART, which stands for Communication Access Real-Time Translation. CART is real-time captioning that gives instant translation of the spoken word. Title number 2 is Communication Board, which is a tool that can be used by persons with limited expressive language ability. Title number 3 is Sign Language Interpreter, which is a professional who translates communication between those who use sign language and those who do not. This does not include foreign language interpreters. Unfortunately, we cannot pay for foreign language interpreters out of the pre-ETS budget. We can provide those to students who are potentially eligible, but it must be paid for out of our regular VR basic budget. Title number 4 is FM system or other assistive learning device, which transmits sound directly to a person who's wearing a sound receiver. Auxiliary aid number 5 is reader or note taker when used as an auxiliary aid. So these auxiliary aid reader or note taker services are provided for individuals who are deaf, hard of hearing, or have a visual impairment only. They are not for individuals who say need an accommodation due to a learning disability. So keep that in mind. And the last auxiliary aid title is Video Remote Interpreting, or VRI. This is a service that provides sign language interpreting through video conference rather than a live on-site interpreter. So the last thing I want to call out, once again, is services in support of Pre-ETS. Remember that, unfortunately, these are not available to students who are potentially eligible for the VR program. If a student needed one of these services, it might be good to consult with a counselor to see if it makes sense to refer them for their full VR program. Here's where you see services in support of Pre-ETS on the definitions for PT contracts document. All right, there are some additional items that can be listed on contracts that I want to also review with you. These other services are Pre-ETS special programming and Pre-ETS as general VR services. Pre-ETS special programming is an option that some providers might choose to include on their contracts for services that provide multiple pre-employment transition services or that don't fit the Pre-ETS rate structure. So here's an example from one provider contract. The provider offers a Pre-ETS exploration or exploring employment class, which is authorized at $100 a day. The contract indicates that the authorization should be divided evenly between 4 of the Pre-ETS services, and those 4 are listed here. So that's how it would look on the contract if there is Pre-ETS special programming as a part of that contract. The last thing you'll see on the definitions for PT contracts document is a section called Continuation of Pre-ETS as a general VR service. This is another section that unfortunately does not pertain to students you'll be serving. It indicates how services to students eligible for the full VR program can be authorized when Pre-ETS are required to end. We're almost there. We're going to finish up with one more quiz. And luckily, we only have 5 questions on this quiz. So please pause the recording, answer true or false for these questions, and then press play to hear the answers. All right, let's review the answers. Number 1 says we need to add separate lines on authorizations for prep time, transportation, etc. And the answer here is false. The time is all rolled into the Pre-ETS services, so there are not extra lines on the authorizations for those items. Number 2, when authorizing Pre-ETS services, you must use the nearest quarterly end date, even if the service will go past that end date. And the answer on that is false. You can use the nearest end date or the one after, but you just can't go beyond that. Number 3, if you are referring a student to a group service, you should authorize at the $30 group service rate. I kind of made some of these tricky. The answer here is false. You would authorize at $75 an hour, and then the provider would bill at $30 an hour if 2 or more students attended. Number 4, the only Pre-ETS required service that has more than one service title is Pre-ETS work-based learning. And that answer is true. Work-based learning has 3 titles: introductory work activities, work experience services, and work experience wages. Pre-ETS auxiliary aids also has more than one title. As you recall, there were 6, but Pre-ETS auxiliary aids is not one of the 5 required services. So that one is a little tricky. Okay, number 5, Pre-ETS auxiliary aids and pre-ETS services in support of pre-ETS are available to students potentially eligible for VR. And the answer to that one is false. Pre-ETS auxiliary aids are available to potentially eligible students, but unfortunately, services in support of pre-ETS are only available to students who are eligible for VR. And we are done with this module. Thank you again for your time. As always, you can connect with your RAM or you can always contact me, Alyssa Klein, if you have any questions.